We should tell you plainly, before anything else, that at 61 years old, Odessa Vantry owned nothing in this world but the clothes on her back, a tin of needles, and $11 folded into a handkerchief that had once belonged to her mother. She had been cast out of the only home she had known for 30 years by her husband's own brother, Cornelius Vantry, a man with a banker's smile and a snake's patience, who claimed, 3 weeks after her husband Thomas was laid in the ground, that the farm had never truly belonged to Thomas at all, but had been signed over to him years before against a debt no one living had ever seen paper for. The county judge, more tired than wicked, sided with the man who could pay for better lawyers, and Odessa walked away from the house, where she had raised 2 children and buried one, carrying only what she could fit into a flour sack. With what little remained of her $11 after a week of hard traveling, she did something the whole town of Thistledown, Minnesota would later call the strangest decision of that whole strange year. She paid $7 at a county auction for an abandoned ice house on the edge of Lake Kittering, a crumbling wooden hulk that had sat empty and rotting for a decade, its roof half caved in, its old sawdust floors gone soft with rot. A building so worthless that the auctioneer had nearly forgotten to call its number. Everyone who watched her raise her hand that morning assumed grief had finally taken her mind. They did not know that behind the old ice shelves, sealed in darkness for 11 years, waited something that would not only restore everything Odessa Vantry had lost, but would quietly, rightfully, save the entire town that had almost let her disappear. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Odessa Vantry. If you're watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or written off before its story was finished, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight. Odessa had been born Odessa Marsh in 1828 in a cabin not far from where the Icehouse would one day stand. Though back then Lake Kittering had no name English settlers had agreed upon, and the land around it belonged more to silence and pine than to any township. Her father, Ezra Marsh, was a cooper by trade, a broad, quiet man who built barrels for the fur traders and later for the ice companies that began creeping up from the cities once the railroads came close enough to matter. Her mother, Ruth, kept the gardens so precise and so abundant that neighbors joked she must have made some private arrangement with the soil itself. And it was from her mother that Odessa learned the 2 things that would define her whole life: patience and the particular dignity of caring for things other people considered used up. Ruth never threw away a cracked jar or a bent nail if it could still hold something, still fasten something, still be of use to somebody. Nothing is finished being useful, she used to tell her daughter, until you've asked it the right question. Odessa did not fully understand this as a child. She understood it slowly as a woman. She married Thomas Vantry in 1847, when she was 19 and he 22, a lean, sun-browned young man who had come north with his older brother Cornelius to work the ice trade, cutting great blocks from the frozen lake each winter and packing them in sawdust to be shipped south before the summer heat could claim them. Thomas was the gentler of the 2 brothers by such a wide measure that neighbors sometimes wondered aloud how they had come from the same mother. Cornelius was ambitious in a way that made people uneasy without being able to say exactly why. He counted things, coins, favors, debts, with a precision that felt less like thrift and more like appetite. Thomas, by contrast, gave away half of what he earned to whoever needed it more, and it was this quality, more than any other, that made Odessa fall in love with him beside the frozen edge of the lake one January evening, watching him help an old widow load firewood onto her sled without being asked and without expecting thanks. They built a modest farm a few miles from the ice operation, raising wheat and, later, dairy cattle, and they raised 2 children of their own, a son, Caleb, who grew up sturdy and quiet like his father, and a daughter, Mary, who did not survive her 4th winter, taken by a fever that swept through the county in 1861 and left a wound in Odessa that never fully closed, only learned to sit quietly beside the rest of her life. Through all of it, through good harvests and lean ones, through the slow grief of losing Mary and the long ache of watching Caleb eventually move west to Dakota Territory to try his own hand at farming, Odessa kept her mother's habit alive. She mended what could be mended, She kept ledgers of every small kindness owed and given, not out of suspicion, but out of care, the way some people keep gardens. She was known around Thistledown as a woman who could make a worn coat look almost new, who could coax a second season out of seed everyone else had given up on, who never once, in 30 years, was heard to say that something or someone was past saving. Thomas, meanwhile, had quietly loaned his brother Cornelius money over the years to help expand the ice business into a proper company, the Kittering Ice Storage Company, which by the 1870s had grown into the backbone of the town's economy, employing dozens of men each winter and shipping ice as far as Chicago. Cornelius ran the company. Thomas, ever generous, ever trusting, had never asked for much paper to prove what he was owed, believing, as he told Odessa more than once, that a brother's word ought to be worth more than a lawyer's ink. It was a belief that would nearly destroy his widow. Thomas Vantry died in the spring of 1888, quietly, in his sleep, after a winter of failing health that everyone had assumed was simple old age. Odessa buried him on a gray April morning beside their daughter Mary, and for 3 weeks the town extended to her the ordinary courtesies of grief. Casseroles left on the porch, quiet nods after church, the particular tenderness communities show a widow before they forget to keep showing it. It was in the 4th week that Cornelius Vantry came to the farmhouse with 2 men Odessa did not recognize and a folded document he said had been drawn up years before, in which Thomas had allegedly transferred the deed of the farm to his brother in exchange for a loan that had, Cornelius claimed, never been repaid. Odessa knew, with the certainty of 30 years of marriage, that no such document reflected any conversation Thomas had ever had with her. But she also knew she had no paper of her own to counter it, because Thomas, true to his gentle and trusting nature, had never asked his brother to sign anything either way. The county judge, a tired man named Alden Purcell who had 3 other land disputes on his docket that same week and no appetite for a 4th, examined the paper, found the signature plausible, and ruled in Cornelius's favor within the hour. Odessa was given 11 days to vacate the only home she had known in 4 decades. She did not weep in front of the judge, and she did not weep in front of Cornelius, though she looked at him for a long moment before she left the courthouse, long enough that he was the one who looked away first. She packed what little the wagon Cornelius grudgingly allowed her could carry, her mother's handkerchief, a Bible, 2 dresses, a sewing kit, a small portrait of Caleb as a boy, and she left the farm on a Tuesday morning in early May, walking the first 4 miles in a Thistledown proper because the wagon driver Cornelius had hired would not carry her any farther without additional payment she did not have. By the time she reached town, she had exactly $11 to her name, money she had kept hidden in a jar beneath a floorboard for years, the modest accumulation of small kindnesses repaid and eggs sold at market, never meant to be a fortune, only ever meant to be a cushion. Now was the entire floor beneath her feet. She might have used that $11 for a room at the boarding house or a train ticket toward Caleb in Dakota Territory, and no one would have blamed her for either choice. Instead, on the very morning she arrived in Thistledown, footsore and dust-covered, she wandered down toward the lake out of some old habit of comfort, the water having always steadied her since childhood, and found a small crowd gathered at a county auction being held on the courthouse lawn to settle unpaid taxes on a handful of abandoned properties. Among them, listed almost as an afterthought at the very end of the auctioneer's ledger, was the old Icehouse belonging to what remained of the original Kittering Ice Storage Company holdings. Not the main operation Cornelius now ran farther up the shore, but a smaller, older icehouse built decades before by the company's first founder. A building so long neglected that its roof had partly collapsed and its foundation had begun to list toward the water. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Grover Dunmore, called for bids almost apologetically, noting that the structure was likely fit only for salvage lumber. No one raised a hand. Odessa, standing at the back of the small crowd with her flour sack over one shoulder and her mother's handkerchief of coins held tight in her fist, found herself stepping forward before she had entirely decided to. $7, she said, and her voice did not shake though her hands did. Dunmore blinked at her, glanced around for any competing interest, found none, and brought his gavel down with a shrug that suggested he thought the whole transaction faintly absurd. And so, on the same day, she lost a 30-year home to a lie. Odessa Vantry became the owner of a ruined icehouse that not a single soul in Thistledown believed was worth the paper of its own deed. She walked the 2 miles out to the old icehouse that same afternoon, before the light failed, wanting to see with her own eyes what 7 of her last $11 had purchased. The building stood alone on a low rise above the lake, separated from Cornelius's newer, larger operation by nearly a mile of scrub pine, and it was worse up close than it had looked from the auction crowd. Its north wall bowed inward, its double doors hanging from one hinge each, its interior smelling of old sawdust, damp rot, and the particular mineral coldness that clings to any place built to hold ice long after the ice itself is gone. Rows of wooden shelving lined the walls, built to hold blocks in even, insulated tiers, though most of the shelves had buckled or split with age. Odessa stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the broken roof, and felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, something other than grief. She felt oddly useful. Here was something everyone had declared finished. Here was a question she intended to ask properly. She began that very evening, with no tools but her hands and a borrowed lantern from a sympathetic boarding house keeper named Mrs. Aldous Finch, who let her sleep in a small back room in exchange for mending linens, a trade that suited Odessa's remaining pride far better than charity would have. Each afternoon for the following 2 weeks, she walked out to the icehouse and worked at clearing it, hauling out rotted sawdust, salvaging what boards could still be salvaged, sweeping the packed dirt floor with a broom she fashioned from pine boughs. It was slow, aching work for a woman past 60, and more than once she sat down on an overturned crate and allowed herself the private luxury of tears, out of sight of the town that had already decided her fate. But she kept returning, because Ruth Marsh's old question kept surfacing in her mind whenever she looked at the ruined shelving. What is this still useful for? It was on the 11th day, while attempting to pry loose a section of the north wall shelving that had swollen with old damp and would not sit flush no matter how she adjusted it, that Odessa noticed the shelf boards along that particular section were thicker than any of the others, and fastened with iron brackets far sturdier than the simple wooden pegs used everywhere else in the building. She might have dismissed it as an old repair, except that when she knocked her knuckle against the wall behind the shelving, the sound came back strangely hollow, entirely unlike the packed earth solidity of the wall beside it. Curiosity, which Odessa had learned long ago to trust the way some women trust intuition, kept her working at the bracket long after the light had begun to fail, until at last, with a groan of old iron, the entire shelf section swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a narrow compartment built into the wall itself, no more than 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, dry as a kept promise, and containing a single iron strongbox, a bundle of oilcloth-wrapped papers, and, resting atop them, a small leather ledger whose cover bore, in faded gilt lettering, the name of a woman Odessa had never once heard spoken in Thistledown, Agatha Kittering. Odessa carried her discovery back to Mrs. Finch's boarding house in the dark, her heart beating with an urgency she had not felt in years, and spent that entire night by candlelight working through the contents with the same patience her mother had once used to coax a second season from stubborn seed. The ledger told a story the town of Thistledown had entirely forgotten, or perhaps had been permitted to forget. Agatha Kittering, it turned out, had not been merely the wife of the ice company's original founder, as the few remaining old-timers vaguely recalled, but had in fact been the founder herself, a widow of considerable business sense who had built the first ice operation on Lake Kittering in the 1850s after her own husband's early death, hiring local men, extending credit to struggling families through hard winters, and establishing, according to her careful, looping handwriting, a private community fund, set aside from her company's profits and never declared to the county, meant expressly for use should the town ever fall into serious hardship, fire, famine, flood, or financial ruin brought by dishonest men. Agatha had written, in an entry dated 1861. Words that Odessa read 3 times over by candlelight. I have watched too many good families lose their footing not because they lacked worth, but because they lacked one honest hand to hold when the ground gave way. Let this fund be that hand long after I am gone, so long as someone honest enough to look for it is willing to ask the right questions. The oilcloth bundle contained deeds, several old promissory notes long since satisfied, and, most strikingly, correspondence between Agatha and a banking house in St. Paul confirming that a sum, invested conservatively over 3 decades in land and modest securities, had been left in trust, its location deliberately obscured from the company's public books after Agatha's own nephew had once attempted, unsuccessfully, to claim it for himself under false pretenses, an episode the ledger described, with weary, exact language that made Odessa's breath catch. For the nephew's name, recorded plainly in Agatha's own hand, was Silas Vantry, Cornelius and Thomas's own grandfather, and the very root, Odessa realized with slow, cold clarity, of the family's long habit of counting other people's inheritances as their own. The strongbox itself, when Odessa finally worked the old lock free with a bent hairpin and considerable patience, contained not gold, as she had half feared and half hoped, but something more useful still. The original trust documents naming the fund's rightful stewardship to be passed to whoever holds honest claim to the Icehouse property and demonstrates the will to use it rightly, along with a modest sum of gold coin, perhaps $300, meant not as personal fortune, but as what? Agatha's own notes called seed money for the asking of right questions. Odessa sat with all of it spread across Mrs. Finch's small table until the candle burned to a stub, understanding slowly that she was not holding a treasure meant to fix her own ruin alone, but something Agatha Kittering had built, decades before, as a hand for the town itself to hold when honest people fell through the cracks dishonest men had made. Word travels quickly in a small place, and it was not long, perhaps 3 weeks, before Cornelius Vantry learned that the widow he had cast off was not simply mending linens at Mrs. Finch's boarding house, but had begun quietly using funds of unclear origin to make repairs to the old Icehouse, to pay overdue debts for 2 struggling families near the lake, and to inquire discreetly at the county recorder's office about old company records concerning his own grandfather Silas. Cornelius arrived at the Icehouse on a warm June afternoon with the same 2 men who had accompanied him to the farmhouse months before, and with considerably less patience than he had shown then. He informed Odessa that whatever she had found on that property legally belonged to the Kittering Ice Storage Company, of which he remained principal owner, and that she would either surrender it to him immediately or face legal action for theft of company assets. Odessa, standing in the doorway of the Icehouse she had rebuilt board by board with her own aching hands, did not raise her voice, though her heart hammered as fiercely as it had the night she found the hidden compartment. She informed Cornelius, with a calm that unsettled him more than shouting would have, that the property in question had been sold at legitimate county auction, its deed transferred cleanly, its contents therefore legally hers by any court's reckoning, and that she happened to possess documentation, in Agatha Kittering's own hand, describing an earlier attempt by his own grandfather to claim the very same trust under false pretenses. An old family pattern she suspected the current judge and the current town might find rather interesting reading. Cornelius left that day without the ledger, though not without threats, and for the following several weeks, Thistledown found itself quietly divided. Some, including old Judge Purcell himself, once the matter reached his desk again, were inclined to side with wealth and precedent, as tired judges often are. Others, the 2 families Odessa had helped, Mrs. Finch, a handful of ice-cutting men who remembered, or half-remembered, old stories about Agatha Kittering's fairness in ways their fathers had once told, began to speak up on Odessa's behalf, recalling small kindnesses she had shown them over 30 years, the coat she had once mended for a stranger's child, the seed corn she had shared during a lean season a decade before. Cornelius, sensing the tide shifting, made the mistake of pressing his claim publicly at a town meeting called to discuss the Icehouse dispute, standing before the gathered townspeople and declaring that Odessa's discovery was, at best, a forgery, and at worst, theft dressed up as sentiment. It was at that meeting that Odessa Vantry rose, quietly, and read aloud, not the full ledger, which she had wisely kept partly private, but the single entry describing Silas Vantry's earlier, failed attempt at the very same deception his grandson now attempted, in Agatha Kittering's own precise and unmistakable hand. A silence fell over the meeting hall that Odessa would remember for the rest of her days, the silence of a town recognizing, all at once, a family's old pattern laid bare in ink that could not be argued with. Judge Purcell, presented afterward with both the original trust documents and independent verification from the St. Paul banking house that the fund had indeed existed under Agatha Kittering's name for over 3 decades, ruled decisively in Odessa's favor, restoring not only clear title to the Icehouse itself, but formal recognition of her stewardship over the trust as Agatha had intended it. For whoever holds honest claim to the property and demonstrates the will to use it rightly. Cornelius, facing both legal defeat and the quiet, permanent erosion of his standing in a town that no longer looked at him the way it once had, did not go to prison, nor did Odessa ask for such a thing. But he lost, within the year, both the confidence of his remaining business partners and the unquestioned authority he had built his whole life around. A slower and in some ways more fitting justice than any courtroom could have delivered. What Odessa did next surprised the town more than the discovery itself had. She did not use the trust to buy back her old farm, though she could have. She did not retreat into comfort, though comfort was, for the first time in years, within her reach. Instead, she used the modest fund almost entirely as Agatha Kittering had intended 30 years before. She paid off the debts of the 2 families she had already been quietly helping. She funded the repair of the town's aging schoolhouse roof, which had been leaking for 3 winters without funds to fix it, and she rebuilt the old Icehouse itself, not as a private dwelling, but as a proper cooperative ice and storage operation, once more, open to any family in Thistledown who needed the work. Or the ice, run under rules of fair credit that echoed, almost word for word, the ones Agatha had written in her ledger decades before. She kept for herself only enough to secure a small, modest cottage near the lake and to send passage money to Caleb, inviting her son home to help her run what she had, only half-jokingly, begun calling the Kittering Trust in the ledger's honor, though most of the town, within a year, had simply started calling it Odessa's Icehouse instead. And so it happened that Odessa Vantry, who at 61 years old had walked into Thistledown with $11 and no roof over her head, cast out by a man who counted her generous, trusting husband's kindness as weakness, found in the coldest and most overlooked corner of the town's memory the very thing that would restore her family's future and, more than that, repair a debt the whole community had not known it was owed. She had bought, for $7, a building everyone agreed was worthless because some quiet, stubborn part of her, inherited from a mother who never threw away a cracked jar if it could still hold something, refused to believe that anything or anyone was finished being useful until someone bothered to ask the right question. It was that same question, asked patiently, board by board, hinge by hinge, that uncovered not merely gold or paper, but a woman's forgotten promise to a town she had loved enough to protect it even after her own death. A promise finally kept, 3 decades late, by another woman willing to look where no one else thought to look. Settle back, if you will, and remember how this story began. With a widow of 61, cast off with nothing, standing before an auctioneer who thought her bid absurd. It is easy, in this life, to look at a person or a place that has been worn down by hard winters and long neglect and decide, as Thistledown nearly decided about Odessa herself, that there is nothing left worth salvaging. But Odessa Vantry understood something her mother had tried for years to teach her. Worth does not disappear simply because it goes unnoticed for a while. It waits, quietly, behind whatever shelving the world has built to hide it, for someone patient enough and humble enough to come asking the right question. She did not set out to find treasure. She set out only to be useful, one more time, in a life that had already asked a great deal of her. That the treasure found her in turn, and that she chose, once she had it, to spend it lifting up the very town that had so nearly let her disappear, is perhaps the truest part of who Odessa Vantry had always been, long before anyone thought to look twice at her. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and for letting Odessa's story sit alongside your own for a little while. If this tale moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that it's never too late for an overlooked life or an overlooked place to matter again. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every answer, and we're always glad to sit with your stories the way we've sat with Odessa's. Until next time, stay close.